All right. See how this goes. Um, Response to Hythloday, the video below. I watched many times. I gave it my full attention one full time. I watched it many other times uh, while I was programming tonight on my own stuff. And as I did, I stopped and I made a little map. We're really just going to talk about the stuff on the bottom, but we'll take a little tour through um, sort of what came up. But I think the stuff about color, we'll talk a little bit about light and color and your dichotomy and my definition of life. Because, I am aware of how these logical systems you're describing. And I'm not violating them, but I'm not endorsing that that's the ultimate way. We'll see. We'll go through here. So you start off with try again. That's a good start. And then it's going to have to be epistemology and ontology. You want to get ahead of the ontology, but we're going to have to start with epistemology. And then you start telling a story about a person in the third person. Here's the guy. Okay, third person, right? Like first person is I, second person is you, third person is he, she, it. Um, Now I start with I exist. So as far as I'm concerned, you're jumping ahead. See, I had this old video um, where I say there's 5 things, and this arrow is in the direction of a relative certainty, right? So the thing we're most certain of is that perceptions happen to us. Looks to me like it's flickering. Is it flickering? It looks flickering over there too. Whatever. And then you have the subjective and solipsistic model of how perceptions behave, right? A theory of perceptual patterns. You see this and then you see that. You start to get a model of materialism. All these things, looks like there's objects. This is where you start to have an object model. Then you have a full materialistic model of how the perceptions are working. In other words, eyes are bringing in information, stuff's on the outside, and you have a full physical concept. And then you can finally get a view as a self as a third person. And you started there and then want to build up. And we have differences in these other layers. And this is just one way of putting layers. It doesn't like having overlapping windows there. Then you did the Descartes thing, and where you said, "Oh, it's a person here. What exists? I, the person." Okay, kind of characterized as a third person, and really in Descartes, it's I think. It's just the first person. So let's say you would accept that potentially, and then you make a distinction that the film strip epistemology is different than Descartes' regular I think, but I think it's almost exactly the same. Basically, it's constructed from making a more careful improvement on what Descartes said. He said, I think, and therefore I am, meaning I have this train of thought. But I think it assumes will. It's like he's doing the thinking. It could be the result of thinking. There's a lot of possibilities that kind of primes a bias against, okay? So it's an improvement to say, well, perceptions are happening, right? The film strip is happening, but it's structurally exactly the same. Perceptions are happening, so things exist. It's just instead of assuming I define I out of the perceptions. It's a thing. There's this observer phenomena, um, whatever it turns out to be. There's the time phenomena in space, color. Then you go through various things about like, do words exist? Of course, in my system, they clearly exist. There's no problem talking about does information or abstractions exist? Do conversations exist? Do they all have what I would call, material evidence of existing? You go into Feynman and the levels of why, which is basically a skeptical argument. So yeah, if you keep asking why, if we say, um, I want to eat dinner, why? Because I'm hungry. Why? Because hunger is designed to tell me that I need more nutrients. And why? Because I'm a self-sustaining entropy pump, and that's wired to know when I need more energy to keep the entropy pump going. But why? Why? Eventually, we'll get to why because of laws of physics. It'll stop being why in the semantic nature of a human question. The question. So yeah, things are relative because obviously we're not going to give up the ability to say, why do you want to go get dinner? Because I'm hungry. However, skeptically, the, we win this argument because the whole point is of objectivists and sort of just this idea that there can be the certainty in some axioms is defeated that way. At least with the question of why, it always can revolve down. It doesn't mean that we all agree to stick at a certain level, and especially in matters like this. You then go into monkey stories about allowances and stuff, which I think sounds like we all decided to agree stuff. Like you're trying to say maybe that you expect me to accept certain conventions, and so you're being really explicit about those conventions. And I can accept things for the sake of argument. It does not mean that I irrevocably for all time agree to never question it. Um, so, for example, here's where we have a stark difference, and I'm really hoping you can just notice this stark difference. And don't be too aghast that I have this different opinion, but the two apples, the two concepts of apple when two people, or the banana, that isn't the same concept. The concept in your brain and my brain is not the same any more than the Word document on your computer is the same as the Word document on my computer, but even less so, because in that case we can have error correcting algorithms, and if we are careful, which generally we wouldn't be, we can catch if there's a deviation. If a file got corrupted on one versus the other, if it's exactly the same. But in the human mind, it's never exactly the same. The example I used in my earlier videos to you, and for years now I reuse this example with words, is words just have to be compatible. So like I use the example of height. If I think someone over 6 foot tall is would be considered tall, I'd say, hey, I met a tall guy today, 6'1". And it would have to be someone 6'5" or taller. We could communicate. A 7 foot person that I saw and said, hey, I saw a tall guy, he would be tall. When you meet him, you're not going to say, hey, I was misled. But would be a 5-inch discrepancy where I might call someone tall and you go, hey, I was misled. Or you might call someone tall and I think maybe they're only 6'1" and they're really tall always for me. So the communication would be skewed, but it'd still work. In the case of an apple, it's like it doesn't matter. Your idea of apple is limited to your pictures and stories and personal apples you've met and heard about. If somebody never seen wild crab apples that are this big, they might not know that they're apples. Or someone might know about I think they're called mountain apples, and it's not an apple at all. It's a Hawaiian fruit, and might think that goes in the category. Or they might just think of all fruit as apples. Like that's not a good example with apples, but with soda pops here in the United States. Some people call it soda, some people call it pop, and some people call it just Coca-Cola, and they mean Sprite and everything else, like a Coke, like it became general, like aspirin. So I know you will say, well, it doesn't matter as long as we uh, nail it down. So, okay, let's talk about that with your color example. There's a couple problems. First of all, when you just arbitrarily set up definitions like that, and oddly enough, you're trying to set up the definition of the abstraction so it relates exactly to something that does have place, and time, right? Because the frequency of light, it's, the wavelength is a distance in space, or the frequency is, you could call it a distance or whatever in time, right? So, fine though. The problem is it's just kind of arbitrary. Why call it red if you're going to do that? It's just region 1, right? Because, you know, the red and it's next to the yellow. What about the orange? You know, some things, yeah, there's going to be that fuzzy boundary, and you're going to say, oh, yeah, but just choose a number. Okay, but then it's not really color. It's already starting not to be what people mean by color because we have a word for wavelength. It's wavelength, right? We don't need to pretend there's a one-to-one and just ignore the fuzzy boundaries because we want there to be a one-to-one. But yeah, you can do it. You can rob the word red. But you're going to run into one problem, which is that there is no wavelength of light that's purple, right? You have red at one end, blue at the other, green in the middle. Between the green and yellow, the green and the red, there's yellow. So if yellow light hits the eyes, it triggers both the red and green cones receptors. You know, some are absorbed by one, some by the other, and your brain connects that as yellow. Also, if you get pure red and green light at the same time, it connects it as yellow. Similarly, over here between green and blue, you get the sky blue cyan kind of color. Similar thing. There's a wavelength of light that's in the middle. If it hits, the cones will react and see that color. Or if it's not really present, you have two pure green and blue, you can mix that color. But where's the purple? There's red and blue, and in the middle is green. Right? So there is no middle to trigger both of those cones. Purple's a totally imaginary color where it's actually the absence of green. Right? If you had white light and you remove the green, there's your purple. So you can call these things you want to call colors, you know, and say, well, they're related to wavelengths, so I can make this physically exact connection, but then purple's left out. So I think that kind of shows how that type of analysis, yeah, it's possible, but you're going to run into limitations. We'll end up talking about those limitations. And even before we start, you know, I explained that this is why this isn't really exactly the approach I prefer. I prefer what I consider more a scientific empirical approach where you get all the data. You compare different frames of the data and you start to notice relationships. Hey, I can say these two are alike and this one does not belong. And I can make these categories. And as I keep doing this analysis, I'll work down to the principles you want to start with, right? And when I get there, sure, I'm going to try to work up and apply them, but and we can see how that works. And if people don't want to work down from the data and they just have their principles from somewhere, I think somebody worked down from the data or tried to, and they just want to work back up and see how it works, fine. But we already know that story. People have already done the dualism. Descartes' dualism is basically the same system as yours, things of extension and things of the mind. And so that's the other two things. So on your dichotomy, just to be clear, I'm rejecting that it's established as a dichotomy. We don't know that anything in one of them isn't in the other, right? Not and, you know, not A and A. We don't know that. We don't know that there aren't things that are in neither of them. But this hasn't been established. It's not simple enough just simply to assume that. The only safe assumption in a logical dichotomy is A and not A. And you can't call, you know, has a space and doesn't have space unless we're just going to talk about that. And as we said, you know, when you draw that picture on your whiteboard, those are graphs, those are abstractions, but it also is a physical thing. It's pixels in this computer and in your computer. It's always a physical thing, all these abstractions. Even a thought is physically, because in the mind, made out of magnets or whatever its version of encoding, you know, however it gets encoded. So that dichotomy is not presented in a way where you've proven that by your definition of red, this color orange counts as red. You didn't do that with these two sets because you haven't shown that they're complementary. And I've claimed repeatedly that abstractions do have physical place. And they're also about physical things. It's real abstract, but a circle is about space. So a circle might not have a location, that particular location, but it has an aspect of space because it's about space, and similarly time gets involved all the time. The other thing is life. And so you have to have a definition. No, if you're collecting data, you can be honestly looking for an explanation. You don't have to have an explanation when you start your detective work, Sherlock Holmes. You don't. Okay. On the other hand, you want to try to accuse that. Well, I do have a theory of a candidate, and I told you what it is. I pretty much from the start, because I went to that Stanford Encyclopedia and I said I endorse all of the points, the pros and cons of all of these methods that they're talking about. I endorse all these other people's methods, and I see the pros and cons myself in many of them. My favorite one, I said, and maybe you could hear this now that I'm repeating it, but my favorite one is entropy. So I'm going to say that my candidate for life definition is an entropy is a sustainable entropy pump that reproduces itself. Okay, so sustainable means that it goes out of its way. It goes out of its way, meaning the water flows uphill and it spends energy to get energy to keep the entropy pump going and control the entropy within it, and it can duplicate itself. That's life.